webinar because they are put on online on our website so that those individuals who could not join us today can watch it at their leisure at another time. So with any further ado, for those who just joined us, please remember to put your name and your district in the chat so that you so that we can use it for attendance. And with that, we're going to start out by just introducing ourselves to you. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Anita Heller, and I'm one of the IU TAC consultants. My area of focus is behavior. I've always loved behavior because it keeps me on my toes. I'm always learning something new, and I love that. And as you can see, I am joined today with one of my team members who also comes from a background of school psychology. And Nanda, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Anita. Well, my name is Nanda Mitra-Idol. I am a school psychologist. I am part-time on the training and consultation team, and then part-time with the secondary transition program. So I have a bit of two hats, but like Anita, love behavior, love trauma. I work a lot with MTSS academics. That's an area, and equity. So those are all the areas that I work in. So between Anita and I, hopefully you'll get a wide range of experiences and stories.
So the first few slides that we're going to share with you are actually part of this series. In case this is the first webinar of the series that you're watching, I just want to share that this is part of a series of webinars that the IU13 is facilitating to provide responsive, high quality, focused professional learning experience that highlights practical as well as actionable strategies for accelerating learning. The topics and contents that have been created this year were developed as a result of a survey and feedback from our local school districts. It also includes evolving research and data from pandemic recovery. And it includes PDE's guidance and our PAIU statewide network expertise.
All right, so the accelerated learning components. The accelerated learning series essentially covers these components, high quality academics, and I'm not going to go through them in detail. You probably have seen them before in other accelerated learning components, but essentially these would be the focuses of any one of the trainings. Academics, which is the purpose, is to really define the instructional changes and really to kind of form data-based decision-making. Supportive learning environments. The purpose really is to ensure that we're providing really a safe and inclusive space for learning, and that's a positive and really has supportive relationships. Healthy systems, making sure the systems are engaging for diverse groups of stakeholders and making sure that they're engaging with your educational community so that all of us get a deeper understanding of the school system. And support and a system of scaffolded support. So, and this component really is to make sure that we have evidence-based practices in academics, behavioral, and social emotional.
So our goal this evening, or this late afternoon, if you will, and the next hour that we have, is really to apply knowledge that we've gathered from trauma-sensitive practices. And what does that look like when we're designing positive behavior support plans? If you haven't yet, you will be able to download on our tiny URL. There are the materials or the slides that Nanda and I will be sharing with you today.
All right. This is essentially for more information. This is a link that you'll have when you download your tiny URL and you get a copy of the presentation. So, for the accelerated learning website that has lots of resources on it.
And then as a final reminder, you will be, if you want your credit, Act 48 credit, please make sure that you complete the evaluation that can be found on the Frontline Professional Growth so that you get that credit. And for those of us who just join us, please make sure that you type in your name and the school district where you work in the chat. Thank you.
All right, so this component really is talks about the accelerated learning system, which is a piece of the roadmap that Pennsylvania is doing. And the roadmap really is a list of resources to support educational staff and our efforts to make sure that during these unpredictable times, we have good information and really good programming, and to really kind of learn from some last year and the year before. So. And it's the idea of the roadmap is supposed to be a repository for current and future tools. And the idea is that we want all the students to feel kind of supported and have the opportunities to heal, to learn, to grow really in our classrooms. And in this phase, the focus is really going to be on, when we talk about accelerated learning, is honoring the lessons we learned, preparing for this and upcoming years, and really closing the achievement gap. I mean, ultimately, that's the purpose, especially in this time of COVID, where the achievement gap seems even greater.
So as we continue, we're actually now going to turn to our topic. Talking about trauma, I recognize that many of you may have had, if not one, multiple trainings in trauma, but Nanda and I thought it would be good to just kind of refresh your memory a little bit about some of the characteristics and why they, how this lends itself to really creating a positive behavior support plan through the lenses of understanding trauma. So many of you probably are already familiar with the definition in front of us. This actually comes out of SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It is a government agency, and they look at trauma as the big 3 E's. In other words, it's an event, or it can be a series of events that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful and threatening. And the 3rd E represents the lasting adversive effects that it has on the individual's functioning, both physically, socially, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So as you can see, you can have 2 people go through a similar traumatic event. However, they may experience it totally different, and as a result, may have different types of adversive effects on themselves.
All right, so an event can be traumatic if, and these are just some components. Again, if it happens unexpectedly, again, it's not something that's necessarily has to be predictable. And this is what we stereotypically think of as traumatic, right? A car accident, the death of someone, a pandemic. If you were unprepared for it, this is something that when we talk about having protective factors, when we talk about having our positives, these are, we're often unprepared and we might not have the coping strategies or protective factors necessary to manage it so that it becomes kind of toxic and traumatic. You felt powerless to prevent it. Often a traumatic event is something where you feel like you have no control in it. And whether a traumatic event can vary from person to person. What might be traumatic to one person may or may not be traumatic to another person, depending on how much power or powerlessness they feel in that particular situation and what are the coping mechanisms they have to balance that out. It happens repeatedly. We know that trauma doesn't necessarily mean a once and done thing. When we talk about trauma, particularly in childhood, we often talk about repeated exposure. We talk about these events that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, then shape, the architecture of the brain. These repeated traumas have an impact on both children and then therefore adults. Someone was intentionally cruel. Trauma can be intentional. We know that, from when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, one of the components, of course, they look at is abuse. So we know that trauma can be caused by something that is intentional, not necessarily it's an accident, and it happened in childhood. Trauma, of course, not only happens to adults, it happens to kids, and kids respond to trauma and process trauma in a very different way than adults. But many times the populations that we work with in schools, the children have experienced some degree of trauma that therefore impacts the behavior.
So I'm sure many of you may have heard of the ACE study. The original one was actually completed in the late 1990s. And it was where 2 physicians, Dr. Robert Anda and Folletti, came together because they found out that individually they were working on different studies that looked at the connection between certain behaviors and mental health and or traumatic backgrounds. So Dr. Folletti was actually working at a weight loss clinic, and he was noticing that his patients were initially very successful, and then all of a sudden they started to sabotage their success. And when he interviewed them individually, he found out that almost all of them had been sexually molested as a child. And he was so shocked by that finding that he thought, maybe this is something we need to look in our society, what's going on. And meanwhile, Robert Anda was looking at the connection between smoking, chronic smoking, and mental health concerns and background experiences. So the two, the one was in the East Coast, the other was in the West Coast, the two got together, and they together created the first ACE study, and they were amazed at the results, and many of their colleagues thought that they were not correct. So the ACE study has been done multiple times since then. The sad thing is, it comes up with the same results, showing us that when, yes, we experience multiple adverse childhood experiences, it can have a distinct effect on our entire lifespan. And while, yes, there are certainly mitigations or protective factors that can mitigate the degree of damage, the reality is there still is a connection. So if we look at the different adversive reactions to trauma, it can be injury, such as traumatic brain injury, breaks, burns, but it can also there might be a mental health component. We know that many people who've experienced scores of 3 or more ACEs struggle with some type of mental health, such as depression, anxiety, and others. We also know that it affects maternal health too. How healthy the pregnancy is, do you carry it to full term? Is there infant death, fetal death? I mean, what are the issues? We also know that it can affect infectious diseases as well as chronic diseases. In fact, one of the big aha moments when the ACE first came out were physicians were seeing that the ACE score was a better predictor of heart disease than blood pressure or some of the other hallmarks that the doctors have used to determine who's at risk for this. And then obviously it puts us at risk for risky behaviors such as substance abuse. And then, yeah, unfortunately, it does affect what kind of opportunities do we have down the road in terms of education, our careers, and our ability to provide for our families financially. So these are all things that we do need to keep aware of. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to have all these issues, but it does take an effect on ourselves. And I will tell you that one of my trainings that I had at one of the buildings, the principal decided she thought it might be a good idea for the faculty as part of our trauma training to actually complete the ACE questionnaire, because she wanted to show how many of us might have had some type of an adverse childhood experience, yet we were able to be resilient, rise above, and be successful as professionals.
Oops. All right. There are many different types of trauma that we look at. And, as Anita mentioned, when you had the ACE study, they had certain types of risk factors listed. But of course, the list has expanded, since then. But it really was groundbreaking in understanding the current types of trauma that we have. Of course, we have natural disasters. That's probably something we commonly think of as trauma. Whether we had, the Hurricane Katrina, or, we've had the earthquakes that were going on, in the South and the Midwest, all of those we typically think of as those natural disasters we think of as traumatic. They're sudden, they're accidental, they're devastating, we're unprepared for it. And then there are, of course, human-caused types of trauma that we often think of as well, both historical and racial. Historical trauma is something that gets passed down often from generation to generation. We have the racial trauma with the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of that has come to the surface, of course, and that gets passed often down intergenerationally as well. So trauma is something that can happen secondarily. So we see this in a lot of students that are in situations of poverty. We see this in a lot of students that come from ethnicities that tend to have historical racism, that you tend to have some of that intergenerational trauma that gets passed forward. And of course, violence, community and school. We have what we typically think of as community violence, whether it's gun violence or, drug violence. And of course, the school shootings and all of that we're very familiar with. But there's a lot of different kinds of trauma, but these are some that are listed. It's important to kind of note that when we talk about trauma, it's not uncommon to have an intersectionality of trauma, to be in more than one category. If I am a Latinx student and I'm coming from maybe some kind of racial trauma that I've experienced, but then maybe I'm also living in an environment that I went through a hurricane, so there might be multiple components of it as well. So many times you will discover your students have more than one there might be more than one risk factor in their environment that has caused their trauma.
And then obviously the first two there are probably the most common that we think of when we think of trauma, the abuse that can happen in a family trauma. As Nanda mentioned, poverty's up there. And as she mentioned, many times individuals can have multiple types of trauma. For example, if I'm thinking of our students who are refugees or immigrants, many times they are leaving a war-torn country where there may have been a lot of violence going on, and they may have even had abusive situations in the refugee camps before they even come to our country, and then struggle here too to get the supports that they need. And then finally, medical trauma is another form of trauma. If you think of some of our kiddos who are very frail, have medical conditions that require multiple operations or multiple procedures that are painful, that is also another form of trauma.
All right. Well, since we're kind of in the middle of a pandemic, we all have a shared trauma. Now, the degree of impact, of course, this pandemic has had varies, right? And again, we talked about what might be traumatic to one person may or may not be traumatic to another. And that's something important to keep in mind with working with our kids. If you have a student that comes from an environment, maybe they haven't had a lot of deaths from this pandemic, they have enough resources that a parent, it's okay if a parent stays home and they're not, or they haven't had a job loss in their house, they might not be as adversely affected as if you have a student that has an intersectionality. Maybe they already come from an environment of poverty. Maybe their parents have lost their job because they worked in the food service industry, and now they've had frequent deaths. We know there's a higher rate of deaths in places of poverty related to the pandemic. So so we know that they might be more vulnerable and be coming in with more trauma. The pandemic trauma manifests itself in many ways. These are just some. Of course, there's a lot of grief, anxiety, depression, a lot of those internalizing behaviors. We know when our students show trauma, and adults too, sometimes they swallow it and they keep it inside, and they might even start to turtle or go in on themselves. Hoodie goes up for some of our adolescents. So we know some of those internalizing behaviors, start to manifest itself in ways we may not recognize initially. Of course, conflicts, we know with the pandemic trauma, there has been a lot more conflicts within families. We also know between conflicts within students. I've had several times when the pandemic first hit that I had to contract for safety because I had students that were now continuously at home in environments that they felt unsafe or unappreciated, and then became suicidal. Impacts on vocation, of course, you know, the pandemic trauma, we know, of course, everything that's happened with turning our work environment and those particular occupations up and down. Isolation, a lot of our students have felt isolated and lost of social connection. It's been very difficult for a lot of the families and students. Structures, routines have completely turned upside down. Of course, we all know about the financial impact. Cost of living has gone up, but although wages have increased, it often doesn't compensate enough for how much things cost. So that's a big stressor for a lot of our families. And of course, we know the physical health impacts. I mean, there's been a lot of physical stress, medical bills that have come back, and of course, death.
So as Nanda says, we've all been under stress in the last year or two through this pandemic. And if we just think a little bit about stress, we know that stress can be positive. It's not all negative. In fact, many of us sometimes need to know there are deadlines or something's going to happen, so I need to get this done in order to be prepared for that. So a little bit of stress is actually good. It helps us, it motivates us sometimes, it gets us moving. The difference between tolerable and toxic stress is that now it's not positive anymore. It's at the point where our stress response may kick in. But the big difference, what makes it tolerable versus toxic, is if I have a support network, someone I can go to and talk to, if I have good coping strategies, if I feel I can meet the demands of that very stressful situation and I can manage it, then it's tolerable. But if I feel I have no supports, if I only have negative coping strategies, this is where it can be toxic to my brain. So Nanda's going to kind of walk us through a little bit what happens with our stress response.
All right, so the stress response really is very much neurochemical, and it is something that affects in young children the very architecture of the brain, meaning if a child has gone through chronic stress, you'll begin to see how their brain responds very differently than maybe a neurotypical child who has not gone through that stress. But when you're thinking of stress, you have, you have three different parts of the brain. Of course, you have your brain stem. So if you're thinking of your hand, and many of you from past trainings on trauma know the hand model of the brain. And so when you're thinking of your hand, you're thinking of, you know, where your wrist is, and that would be your brain stem. Those are your autonomic functions. Those are breathing, heart rate, functions in your body that you don't normally think of. Then you move up your hand to your palm, right, the middle of your hand, and that's where your limbic system comes in. And your limbic system is the emotional center of the brain. This is the fire alarm. This is when there is a trigger, and triggers vary per student. It could be a slamming door, a loud voice, a lawnmower outside, something completely innocuous to the teacher and other students, but to that particular student as a trigger, that emotional center of the brain kicks in, and that is responsible for survival. And that is an automatic, you don't think about it, it just kind of kicks in part of the brain. But that's that emotional center, and that's where we talk about later what some of the reactions look like. We'll talk about that, but that's that center of the brain that's responsible for that. And when you move up your hand, when you talk about your fingertips, and if you kind of carry it over, this is your neocortex, right? That's a higher order. That's language processing, understanding, and communicating, reasoning. That is problem solving, thinking, delayed gratification. That's all of those wonderful things we like to see in school. What happens is when we have a situation that we go from tolerable stress, like it's okay, it's a test, I'm a little bit stressed, but I can handle it, to something that might be more toxic, that's overwhelming our system, it was unexpected, maybe our brain is just, it happens so much that I just can't handle it, my parents are arguing all the time, whatever it is, what happens is this part of the brain, that neocortex, is saying, oops, there's something coming up, we need the emotional part of the brain to act quick, we need an automatic reaction. It flips, it shuts off, because we know the emotional center of the brain and the neocortex do not work together very, very well. When one is on, one is off, and they work in varying degrees of each other in opposite directions. So we know when there's a trigger, the limbic system kicks in, and for whatever natural reaction that person has, they will kick in, and then we know the higher order brain starts to shut off. And we know that system happens until the student feels safe, until the brain determines, that limbic system determines it's safe, and then they slowly start to bring the neocortex back in line. And that varies, of course, length of time for students. There's a lot of, it's a complex neurochemical system, but we know that the neurochemicals are like floating around the brain for a while, and it can take anywhere from 20 minutes just to get the student to a point you can start to engage in therapeutic rapport to like several hours. So it does vary, of course, but that's roughly how it works. The student essentially has flipped the lid, right? And then they start to kind of come back down when they believe that the stressor is gone.
So basically, this slide just shows what Nanda was explaining about flipping the lid. This comes from Dan Siegel, who often talks about the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain, and the upstairs brain being, as Nanda showed us, the cortex of the brain, which kind of regulates and controls and thinks and reasons. And this is the part of the brain that we need to activate when we want kids to learn. But when kids are having meltdowns and temper tantrums, or angry or upset, or extremely fearful or scared, it's, as Nanda was saying, that thumb in the middle of your hand, that's what's activated right there. And they can't rationalize now. This is where their fight, flight, freeze response kicks in. And what I like that quote about Dan Siegel there at the bottom is that any of us can flip our lid, or any of us can downshift to the downstairs brain, which is the emotional part of the brain that controls your breathing, your blood pressure, your temperature. This is what kicks in the extra adrenaline when you have to run or flee something or fight. So anyways, any of us can downshift to that downstairs brain and dysregulate. And this can happen when we're tired, when we're overstressed out, if we feel we're not being respected, our values, expectations, or beliefs are being challenged. So in other words, this can happen to educators when you've got a challenging kid telling you where to go or calling you all sorts of beautiful, colorful words. Or our fear might kick in too. What are they going to do next, especially if the student's much taller than me? So we all can unfortunately get down to our downstairs brain, and that's why we all need to have coping strategies for calming down that emotional part so that the upstairs brain, the cortex, can kick in and make some good decisions.
All right, so, and here's some of what Anita referred to a little bit. These tend to be the 3 responses that your limbic system is going to have. And these responses are going to vary like per person. And sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not. Most of the time in our case, if we're being called in, is probably not a productive response. So we have the fight, and that tends to be yelling, screaming, being pushy. I had a teacher once give me a really good example of them. There was a really stressful situation, a medical emergency with their child, and they went into the fight phase. And in this case, it helped them to get their child to the medical care that they needed to survive. And that was a really, really good example from this particular educator about being aggressive enough to get their child the medical care that they needed. But most of the time in our case, it's usually not productive. This is when they start to maybe throw chairs, or they just start, when we're talking about the kite and our CPI, they start to get defensive, right? Flight is another one. These are our elopers. Many times, especially our little ones, they tend to run away. They might ignore us. They might refuse to talk. Their substance abuse is listed here. So they're essentially trying to escape in some way. We know that when teenagers get stressed, it's not uncommon for them to start to disconnect with people that they care about, with friends, and we know that it's not uncommon to engage in risky behaviors, whether it's substance abuse or increased sexual activity. So we know this tends to increase a lot in our adolescents, particularly. And I've seen more the fight in more of my little ones, and then the flight in some of my older ones. And it's not always the case, obviously. And then freeze, of course. Freeze is you start to see almost like they don't know what to do. It's like suddenly like that appearing numb is probably a really good example of the freeze. You know, they space out, they appear really frozen, unresponsive. It's like, you know, for a second, they're almost like zombie-like. They're just like, they just don't know what to do, and they're just frozen in their spot. So, and it doesn't, any one person can experience multiple of these. So you may have a student that in response, that again has an intersectionality of trauma, and our students sometimes hide it really, really well. And, you know, as we talked about in the ACEs study, the way the ACEs study was based on college or above educated, mostly white population. So it's a population that didn't normally stereotypically think of as having trauma, but they would exhibit. In one case, you might have a freeze, the kid just kind of looks like they're spacing out, but they're actually having a response to a trauma. Maybe there's someone yelling in the hallway and they're just freezing because it reminds them of some arguing at home. And in another circumstance, they're getting into a fight in the hallway because someone badmouthed them, and then it reminds them of some verbal abuse that they've gone through. So it does really vary. The response can vary even within the person, but these are roughly the three main exhibitions of stress we'll see.
And I'm going to add that sometimes kiddos who freeze and I'm thinking in particular kids who struggle with anxiety, it does not necessarily look like they're spacing out. I'll have teachers say, oh, they're just being manipulative. They're refusing to do what I told them to do. And it may be that in that moment, they don't feel they can do that particular task. And so they do nothing. But I know many of kids who struggle with anxiety that's their go-to when they're super anxious. And it doesn't necessarily look that clear to the teachers, and teachers feel that they're just being oppositional. So just some food for thought to keep in mind. Here's some other very common responses to trauma. I'm sure you're probably familiar with many of these or have heard this before. The anxiety is a biggie. We have kids going to the nurse with stomach aches, disruptive sleep. If you look at this, I don't know, I think many of us have experienced one or two of these characteristics in the last 2 years, just with the pandemic alone. That hypersensitivity to loud noise, loud sudden movements, kids can overreact and jerk, you know. So these are just some things that we need to keep in mind. And I realize looking at our time that we need to kind of move on, but we wanted to kind of wrap things up with trauma so we can take this information and apply it to designing plans.
Yep. All right. So moving on, let's see, triggers. This is pretty self-explanatory when we talk about triggers that activate the fight, flight, or freeze response. Again, it varies per student. No, you're going to have to learn what your triggers are for your student. But the trigger is almost always something that reminds them of the past trauma, whether it's directly or indirectly. It reminds them of the past trauma. The brain is triggered into going into fight, flight, or freeze. So the brain is triggered into thinking the situation is dangerous. I need to keep this person safe. My frontal lobe is shutting off, and my limbic system is kicking in. That's essentially what's happening, in a matter of seconds. There's a quick story is that I heard from someone else. This is not my direct experience, that they were trying to figure out why the student kept acting up and was having incidences. But their trigger was every Wednesday there was a lawnmower outside, and it was interesting. And that story stuck with me, that another presenter said, because you just never know sometimes. It might not even be something you're thinking of. And responses, again, it can be considered confusing and out of character. You might have a really low key, pretty chill kid, and suddenly he's freaking out, you know, and he's having like, you know, an externalizing moment. And so you never know.
And finally, this last slide again shows additional possible triggers that can create a meltdown. And I'll give you an example of one student. This was an MDS student who could not talk, didn't have a form of communication, and yet she had meltdowns often in the cafeteria, but it wasn't every day in the cafeteria. And they couldn't figure out why it was certain days until they realized that it was only when they were serving tacos for meal that she would have a meltdown. And they still couldn't figure out, what does the smell of tacos have to do with making her all anxiety and crying and kicking and biting and whatnot, until they met with the parent, and the parent reported that, yeah, she used to put taco sauce on the child's tongue when she wanted her to be quiet. So that's why the smell of tacos in the lunchroom would set her off. So there's a lot of different ways that students can be triggered. And so we wanted to give you a moment to go ahead, Nanda.
Doesn't matter to me. It's fine if you wanted to do it. We're going to give you a moment to participate. We know it's a fast, and we know we're doing a lot of talking, but in the chat, if you want to type in, what are some commonly observed responses to trauma among the students you work with? What do you see? If you want to just type it in the chat, Anita and I can read it out. And also, how many of the students you have developed positive behavior support plans are likely to have experienced trauma. So think about the traumatic responses that you see in your kids, and think about the PBSP plans, that you have, and how many of them do you think, now that you're looking at it through trauma-informed glasses, might have trauma. So just type it in the chat. Common responses, what do you see in your kids? We don't want to spend a lot of time on it because we know we have to move on, but we did want to hear. Okay, great. All right, let's see. Disconnecting, absolutely. Yelling at other students or leaving the classroom abruptly, absolutely. We definitely see that's a good example of a combination, right, of flight and fight. Covering face and body with a hoodie or anything available. Yep, I have definitely seen that too. They almost try to disappear in their seat. Rocking, refusing to move, leaving the classroom. I've seen that in some of my MDS kids, actually, that particular one too. Absolutely. Acting out externally. Students refuse to communicate, and express feelings when overwhelmed or frustrated with a task. Absolutely. And the refusing to communicate is going to be normal because keep in mind that the part of the brain that's responsible for language and reasoning is shutting down. So they're turning into very very simple, almost like little, not quite caveman like, but the more aggressive someone gets, the more simple their statements get, and it just doesn't get. It's harder to reason with kids when that part of the brain is shut down, and you just have to wait till that frontal lobe comes back online to communicate. So absolutely. Let's see, shutting down, going mute. Yes, physical aggression, hood up, leaving the classroom, fidgeting. Yeah, shutting down. Let's see, someone else said withdrawal or physicality. I think of all learners that I've worked with will have some experience. Yes, it's true. A lot of the learners that we work with have some level of trauma, absolutely. Being out of their location, let's see, shutting down, feeling numb, avoiding eye contact. Let's see, someone says refusing to shut down, fidgeting, and they've developed a lot of PBSPs for students that likely have experienced trauma. Absolutely. And particularly now more than ever, we know a lot of our students have some level of trauma. So it's important to keep that in mind as we write the behavior plans, that we're flipping the script a little bit, right? When we take a look at a student, for example, that might be, maybe our student is looking like their head is down, and then you might hear a teacher say, well, they're just being lazy, but maybe they just don't have the skills to do it, and they're just and they don't have the good self-confidence, from feeling traumatized. Or maybe a student is, engaging in some of that fight behavior or that fidgetiness someone talked about. And, they're just trying to seek a connection. When you start taking a look at your trauma-informed glasses, you flip the script. That attention-seeking behavior comes into connection-seeking behavior. Right now, they're looking for a connection. And you'll approach designing a PBSP for a student who's seeking a connection very differently than someone who's seeking attention.
Okay, we're going to move on so that we get through our content in time. As you can tell, Nanda and I are not used to only having 45 to 60 minutes to go through a quick little seminar here. But as we start thinking about interventions that we might apply for our students that need additional support behaviorally and emotionally, we need to keep in mind that not all strategies work for all students. We also know that all students need routine and procedures in the classroom. But let me tell you, especially kids coming from trauma, where they have unpredictable lives outside of school, that this is even more important. And I will say this, especially now that we've all lived in a pandemic, and you've had some kids who've been online and back face to face, and others who may have been homeschooled or put in a cyber school and now returned to school. It's even more important that we have routines and procedures. And we need to give grace to those kids who haven't been face to face for a long time to adjust to coming back to school as well. We need to prepare students whenever there are changes in routines. We know that because so much has happened, especially now during the pandemic, that kids feel they have no control over what's happening to them. It's really important then that we offer choices that are developmentally appropriate for them. And then we almost have to think ahead. Can we anticipate what difficulties might lie, or where will it be difficult to transition? And how can we provide additional support during those times?
All right, so when considering interventions, teach techniques for self-regulation. This particular strategy is probably more important now than ever, and it's very difficult to do. We know with the pacing of the curriculum and trying to get kids to not only to, it was already difficult to get them to learn the content of the year that we needed them to learn with the certain behavioral challenges, but now, of course, with the added achievement gap, I know it's much more difficult. But teaching them self-regulation techniques is going to make life a lot easier in the long run, because now they have these behaviors that are bigger than them. And it's really important to teach them how to manage those behaviors. And the self-regulation, there's many, many different kinds, whether you're teaching them just to simply identify how they're feeling and pair it with an appropriate strategy, or pair it with an appropriate behavior, replacement behavior, or you're teaching them like more of a cognitive behavioral approach. I mean, whatever approach that you're tend to using, it is important to kind of take a moment and teach them how to regulate themselves. I see a lot of kids come in when, especially in the school to work end, that haven't learned this self-regulation strategy. So we're scrambling at this point to teach it to them in order to get them out into the work world so that they're productive, safe citizens. But it's really important to start this in elementary. Understand that youth makes sense of experiences via reenactment through play or interactions. Keep in mind that kids are very experiential, even middle school. Like, we think we can talk to them and talk about the experiences, but they're very, very experiential. And youth often make sense of the world by how they interact with each other and how they interact with little ones through play and through toys, playground behavior, hallway behavior, with your teens. All that reenactment and all those interactions with others is often how they're understanding and making sense through the world. So when we used to talk about those teachable moments, teaching them in the moment, that's really, really important, particularly with students that have experienced trauma. Providing nurturance and being sensitive to individual triggers, it's really important our students feel nurtured and cared for and not judged. Many of our kids are already hyper aware, they're already feeling disengaged, they're already feeling kind of weird, so to speak, and they know that something is a little different. Many in elementary, they start to blame themselves. So it's really important that without having them feel judged, we provide that nurturing and that sensitivity. And again, using positive reinforcement. We know research has talked about for a really, really long time, punishment generally doesn't work. It might discourage the behavior when an adult or whoever the administrator of punishment is given, but it doesn't in the long run decrease the behavior, nor does it in the long run get the student to learn how to decrease it. But we know that positive reinforcement is much more powerful. Using positivity and even teaching the student again how to use that positive reinforcement with themselves, as they get older, and that self-regulation is important.
So when we start looking at the assessment piece and gathering our data to determine how are we going to create this behavior plan, we really need to incorporate, is trauma part of the trigger? Is it part of the antecedent? What is the background of the student? So we really do need to include that in assessment. So we're looking at in what context does the behavior occur, and what might be those things that come before the behavior. Sometimes it helps asking the students, so why, what's happened to you? Or what led you to do this? Or really digging a little deeper. Asking more questions of those working with a student. Does he always respond this way? In what situations does he respond this way? Is it always this time of the day? Is it always in this environment? And then reaching out to family. I think sometimes it's very difficult to unearth data about trauma, especially if it's something that family does not feel comfortable or they're embarrassed to share what's going on. But I think we always need to keep it there as this. There might be some trauma that's going on with this kiddo. So what can we do that would be good practices for any child, but especially for a child that comes from a trauma background? So we're going to look at what are some things we can build on with antecedents, because this is like setting the stage.
Yeah, and as Anita really elegantly said, antecedents are what happens before. And we know that if you're going to change something, if you can change the antecedent, you can set the stage to make it, to set the stage for positive behaviors to occur or expected behaviors to occur versus unexpected, is much more powerful. It's probably one of the harder parts of a behavior plan to do, but it is also the one that will yield the greatest results. So this is where you're going to have to probably get more brains together and really kind of think about and experiment a little bit. But some things you can do for an antecedent, for example, is creating a positive, welcoming school climate. Schools these days can be very stressful places for kids. I was in a school, and what was interesting is they did a school climate survey, and the teachers were very surprised at the students' responses. And this was an elementary school, and the teachers were surprised because students didn't feel connected to the kids, or the kids didn't feel connected to the teachers. And they came in, they performed, they said they liked the school, but they didn't feel connected to the teachers. And the teachers were like blown, their minds were blown. They had no idea. So it's really important to make sure that we're trying to create an environment that they all feel loved and appreciated and welcomed. Predictable routines is great for our students, especially in this time where things are slightly unpredictable. Visual schedules, making sure we have procedures, expectations clearly stated in the positive instead of the negative. Communicating, again, expected behavior, rehearsing those expected behaviors. We have to remember that not all our students know what those expected behaviors are supposed to look like. What does it look like when I'm sitting in my seat and engaged in work? What does it look like if I'm getting my teacher's attention in an appropriate way? What does it look like if I'm beginning to feel upset and I need to remove myself from the situation? What is the expected behavior for those? Designing and organizing an environment with defined spaces. It's really helpful sometimes for students if the room is organized as such they know where to go for what. This is where I go for the books. Some classrooms often have a corner or a space in the room where students can de-escalate. There's a chair or a comfy spot. Sometimes there's procedures that the students can go through. There's like almost like a little visual on the back that said, this is what I go through to de-escalate, but it's a spot that they can go to. Some classrooms, teachers have snacks in that spot, so that to get their blood sugar back up. Some teachers, again, engaging in maybe soft lighting. Sometimes we know those overhead lights, some of the buzzing can drive our students a little bit nuts. Being aware of the students, providing appropriate, again, supervision, being aware of the students' body language and tone. It's really important to know your students and to know the class tone as overall. And sometimes we get so busy in trying to deliver instruction, we don't really look very closely to their body language, and we might miss certain cues. And it's really important when we're taking a look at antecedents to look for patterns within the student or within the class. So if you notice that Mondays tend to be a little bit rammy in your room, there might be added procedures that we do on a Monday in order to kind of make the week start off better. Maybe class meeting is a little longer to give them a little bit of time to kind of get stuff off their brain. Or if we know after lunch, there's a particular student that gets a little rammy, maybe we give them a little a transition time. So antecedents are just prevention. And I can't reiterate enough how powerful it is, and it is worth the investment in time to really hone in on this and do this accurately.
So some additional strategies that you might want to keep in mind when you're looking at how can we prevent situations from happening is Nanda already talked about creating that safe classroom, low-level lighting. But this particularly means to creating a specific space where the student can go to self-regulate, to calm. So I'm thinking of many, for example, emotional support classes in particular, and sometimes other special educational classes have a specific corner. Some schools call it the peace corner, some call it the calming area. Some schools may actually have what they call a meditation room too, where they can go to just unwind, to actually catch their breath, to calm down. And that's where they can engage in some self-regulatory activities or deep breathing, or maybe listening to soft music. I'm thinking of one particular classroom that I went in that walking in alone had a calming effect. She used all natural lighting. Her calming corner was actually in the middle of the back of the room, and she created a tent with gauze like material, and she had Christmas lights hanging around and cushions inside the tent for the kids to go to calm down when they were upset. Or they could also go back there to read if no one was using it as a de-escalation. But there was a very nice calming sense of relaxation in her room. She also had passes that were already pre-made, and students, she had a procedure where students could go pick up a pass and use it to just walk up and down the hallway for a minute and then come back into class and re-engage in the activity. So those were some of the things she did to try to help create a calm, safe place. We also know that students, some teachers are very good at preparing students for transitions by letting them know ahead of time. Today we may have a drill, we don't know when, but when this happens and this signal goes off, this is what we need to do. And it's okay, we will do it. It's all right not to worry about it. Many teachers have some type of transition signal to move from one type of activity to another. I've been in some classrooms where they actually have a timer on the smart board that goes off or dings. I've been in others where they play a few notes of music when it's time for transition. I've seen in secondary classes where the teacher actually takes 1 minute for the whole class to just catch their breath and focus on their breath and not do anything, but focus on their feet on the floor and their breath going in and out. And she calls it allows them to arrive, to get their brains focused on her class now. And yeah, it works great. So we also know that looking at our seating arrangements, some of our kids do not respond well sitting next to someone else, that they like enough a space around them. Sometimes we need to look, are there certain kids that trigger each other and shouldn't be partners sitting next to each other at their desk? We also need to have safety procedures in place and communicate it to students why we have those procedures in place and what it means and why we want to keep everyone safe. Nanda already talked about the importance of positive feedback. We know that kids learn more when we take a situation and turn it into a learning experience. We use natural and logical consequences. And as your grandmother may have said, you can gather more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. So we all know that we all respond better to positive acknowledgement than punitive measurements. The other thing is we really do need to allow students some voice and choice to learning projects. We will gather more motivation if they have some say into how they show what they've learned, or to also have the opportunity to talk and not always pick on the same kids when they're raising their hands, but allow everyone a chance to respond.
All right, so I know we're running short on time. I'm looking at the time thinking, wow, there's so much more good stuff to talk about. So I'm going to kind of go through this quickly because we've talked a lot about antecedents and prevention. Here's some other strategies, and a lot of these you can kind of read through, are really focused on having that relationship with kids. The summary I'm going to say is have do your best to connect with kids. If you have a Check and Connect program, a mentorship program, a lunch bunch program, even the greeting kids by name at the door, having special like dances or handshakes, letting kids know that they matter, that it comes to school is really important. And I mean non-academically. Many of our students feel like they only matter in an academic way, and that's all my teachers care about. And this is self-report from students I have heard. And data from districts I have seen that what that indicates. It's really important now more than ever that we have students, we allow them to know, and we do it through, again, our actions. Remember, kids are experiential learners, that they matter out of the academic realm. They matter as a human being, and we take the time to engage in any number of these strategies.
And the only one I'm going to point out here too, because we're running out of time, is definitely to encourage the student to be part of the plan. Sometimes kids come up with some great ideas. If we sit down and include them as part of that team discussion, what's going to help you to achieve this goal? What do you think the goal should be? We're focusing on this behavior. So again, I think that's really important to pull them into the conversation.
Absolutely. Behavior, our goal to address behaviors that interfere with their academic functioning, and identify and understand the source of the problem. Essentially, well, the goal is to identify the behavior, know that all behavior has a purpose. Behavior is communication. They're communicating something with us, and it's an unmet need of some kind. We have to determine what the need is, and you give them in a more appropriate replacement behavior to meet that same need. Because if you don't do that and give them something, they're going to then they still have that need, and the behavior is more likely to continue, or is more likely to reemerge. So that's all this is really kind of talking about, is make sure they give them appropriate replacement behavior. You might have to teach them skills to do it, but make sure it gives them something that helps them to solve their problem in a more socially acceptable way.
So the last part to keep in mind when we're developing plans is, okay, so we probably load up very heavily on those antecedents. But now what do we do when the behavior occurs that, that we're trying to address, that we don't want to see? So one of the first thing is, please address any concerns or issues in private, not in public. The whole idea of shaming does not work. It will backfire on us, and especially with a child with trauma. The shame blame game is not productive, and it makes things worse, not better. The other thing is, once you do have your plan, is make sure that everyone who works with that student is cognizant and aware of the plan. I know many times when I was the school psychologist, I'd create the plan and gave it to the teacher, and no one else ever saw it. So the PCAs, the paras who worked with the student, they weren't aware of how they were supposed to respond to inappropriate behavior, nor how they were supposed to respond to the appropriate wanted. If the behavior isn't serious, sometimes the best response at a consequence is planned ignoring. But if it is important, then we definitely need to tag the behavior. We need to address it. Another thing, we need to look for opportunities. How do we, as I said earlier, turn this into a teaching opportunity? We need to give language to kids, teach them. We want to validate their emotions, teach them how to define them, and to tell us also the degree of intensity. If they're angry, how angry are they feeling? If they're hurt, how hurt do they feel? If they're scared or anxious, how deep are those feelings, so that we can address them? And then we kind of already talked about the importance of logical and natural consequences. It's really important if you can connect the consequence to the behavior so that they see and learn the connection. One thing with kids from trauma, response cost does not work. It can be more damning to them than anything else. So in other words, taking away points that they already earned for appropriate behavior is not productive with this population.
All right, so I know we're over our time. So just to point out here, it's important to explain the reason. We sometimes are so busy working around kids, accommodating around kids, trying to teach them things, but not really giving them the why. make sure you explain to the kids why they're doing it. That's part of, again, self-regulation. If they know the why and they know the context of it, they can, and they have a level of understanding, they'll start to regulate themselves. They're more likely to use it. Teach coping strategies for addressing the frustration. Again, so we have to sometimes explicitly teach things that we think students should already know, but keep in mind many of our students may or may not have learned that, how to cope with that particular skill, or may have an intersectionality of trauma that they might not know how to handle. So these are just some strategies: progressive muscle relaxation, deep breathing. But so teach the skill, give them the why. Keep in mind that for consequences to whatever consequences that you're using, you have to have a relationship with students for it to be effective. If you don't have a relationship and the student doesn't care about what you think or doesn't feel like you're invested in them, it's a lot less likely to be effective. So making sure you have that connection is important.
And then finally, along with teaching those replacement skills, what you want to see them do instead is sometimes you're going to need tools to learn how to self-regulate. So they might be coloring mandalas, they may be sensory items. You might have your OT develop a sensory diet that meets the needs of that particular student. You might have to build in breaks or build in opportunities for movement. The one thing I'm going to say about that is, because I know many schools engage in those brain breaks where they'll put on videos that get everyone up and going. If we don't provide a cool down period after that movement, it can keep kids up there. They can't focus on work. So we need to do something. You know, if you're doing a high activity movement, it needs to be followed either by some stretching, deep breathing, something to bring them down so that they can focus next. And we certainly know that emotional regulation can be embedded in the rest of our curriculum and literature. And then obviously, we need to provide those safe spaces that we had for preventive measures. We need to provide them when students feel overwhelmed to help bring them down so that we can teach another way of responding. And that kind of leads us to our last final questions and concerns. We do have a slide following this where all our references are located. And these are some additional learning resources that are all part of the series. If you click on any of these, it will take you either to a list of recordings from previous webinars or webinars that will be following us. It will take you to resources as well. So I'm just going to go back. And for any of those of you who are still with us, let me unshare the video and bring your smiling faces back. And if there are any questions, please, we're small enough a group, please feel free to unmic yourself, comments, questions, and we'll be glad to respond to them.
If not, you're finished. You can log off, but we'll hang out in case you have questions. I think.
There we go, save chat, okay.
Oh, Linda is asking for, do you have a short URL? I can get it up while it's in the presentation. I just realized I can
get that.
I'll give her that short URL.
Okay, you got it?
I should be able to, yeah, let me put it in here. There it is. Get that, Linda? Or you can probably stop the recording.
I did.
Oh, you did. Oh, you're ahead of me. I just realized.
That's okay.
People don't care.
I clicked on it and stop it. So yes, now I just have to figure out how to load it up to Google Drive.
Yeah. That I can't do. I don't have actually the updated version of of
Oh,
Zoom. So, but I did send a copy of the chat. I had saved earlier the attendance, and I did save it and send it out to
okay.
you and to Linda. So I wanted to make sure to get that before
Yeah, sure.
I forgot about it. So I
You're
did
just
send that.
you're just on top of things, Amanda.
I don't know about that every now and then.
Well, thank you for helping me out today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, it was. I just felt like we were running the races. Because I realized once we got started that you can't add a lot of examples because you don't have enough time.
I know it was really hard. I was sitting on my hands actually trying to keep myself from like talking too much as a strategy to remind myself to shush up.
Oh, well, anyways, well, have a great evening.
You too. Bye.
See ya, bye.